They rode to work in metal lunch boxes and sat sweating in school bags. A single egg, a smear of lard, leftover potatoes on toast, whatever could be held between two slices of bread. These sandwiches were strange, stubborn, and resourceful, just like the folks who made them. Flour dumplings in tomato juice. When the meat ran out, but the hunger didn't, flour dumplings in tomato juice filled the gap. It started with a pot of cheap tomato juice, poured straight from the can into a dented saucepan, thinned with a little water if you needed to stretch it. You brought the juice to a simmer, bubbling slow, smelling sharp and sour in the warm kitchen. Then came the dumplings, nothing but flour, salt, and a splash of water, stirred into a thick, heavy dough you could scoop up by the spoonful. You dropped rough lumps of dough straight into the boiling tomato broth. They floated up fat and lumpy, soaking in the juice, steaming in the heat. Some folks seasoned the broth with a little black pepper. Some added a dab of bacon grease or a crumbled bouillon cube, if they had one. Most just let it be, simple and sharp, the dumplings soft and chewy against the tangy broth. It wasn't a meal built for joy. It was a meal built to survive. Heavy dumplings, thin broth, and a little heat, enough to trick a growling stomach into silence for one more night. Onion soup with croutons and broth. You took 3 onions, not because you wanted to, but because that's all you had. You sliced them thin, fried them low and slow in a little butter or oil until they went golden and soft. Then you added broth, real if you had it, bouillon if you didn't. Let it simmer until the house smelled like something worth remembering. Meanwhile, you toasted old bread, cubed it rough, and dropped it into bowls. The soup got ladled over the top, the bread soaking in until it barely held together. No cheese, no frills, just onions, broth, and the taste of getting by. And for that night, that was enough. Creamed corn sandwich. There was a time when canned creamed corn was everywhere, on tables, in casseroles, poured over biscuits. But one of its lesser-known roles was between bread. 2 slices of white sandwich bread, usually untoasted, soaked up a generous spoonful of cold or room-temperature creamed corn. It oozed out the sides, slippery and bright yellow. The bread went soggy fast, so you had to eat it quick, no dawdling. This wasn't a sandwich made for presentation. It was born from a single can, meant to feed 6 people, spread thin across whatever starch was available. If the corn was warm, it felt like comfort. If it was cold, it was necessity. School kids ate it at lunchtime. Working men ate it while walking to the bus stop. Sometimes it was paired with a slice of tomato or a thin sheet of onion, but even plain, it served its purpose. Fill the belly, don't break the bank. Nowadays, the thought of a corn sandwich might make someone queasy. But then again, most people today haven't stood in front of a cabinet with only 1 can and a loaf of bread and had to make it work. Milk toast, bread, and hot milk. There was nothing fancy about milk toast. It was the kind of meal you made when your body needed warmth and your wallet was empty. It started with stale bread, soft white slices that had seen better days. You toasted them lightly if the stove worked, or just tore them into pieces if it didn't. Meanwhile, you warmed a pan of milk, whole if you had it, watered down if you didn't, stirring slow so it wouldn't scorch. A pinch of salt, maybe a dab of butter, or a shake of sugar, depending on what kind of night it had been. Once the milk was hot, you poured it straight over the bread in a bowl, letting it soak in and soften everything until it was more comfort than food. It was quiet, it was plain, and it went down easy. For sick days, end-of-month nights, or just when there wasn't much else to eat, milk toast did the job. It warmed your hands, it calmed your stomach, and it reminded you that sometimes Survival didn't look like a feast. It looked like a bowl of hot milk poured over bread, and that was good enough. Tuna noodle casserole, heavy on noodles. It was never about the tuna. It was about making one can of fish stretch over a whole pan of noodles and come out tasting like something someone might call a casserole. You boiled egg noodles, drained them, and stirred in canned cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and one lone can of tuna, drained and flaked to disappear evenly through the mix. Some folks added peas or shredded cheese if they had it. Most didn't. Everything got dumped into a baking dish and topped with crushed crackers, breadcrumbs, or whatever could add a bit of crunch. Baked until golden, tuna noodle casserole wasn't flashy, but it was warm, soft, and predictable. Three things you clung to when the world outside the oven wasn't. Cornmeal gravy over biscuits. Gravy didn't need drippings. It didn't need sausage. Sometimes it didn't even need meat at all. It needed cornmeal, water, and stubbornness. You browned a handful of cornmeal in a hot skillet, stirring it steady, letting it go just dark enough to smell like roasted corn. Then you poured in water, slow, careful, and kept stirring until it thickened into something closer to porridge than gravy. Salt, pepper, maybe a crack of cayenne if you were lucky enough to have a spice tin tucked away. You split open rough-made biscuits, flour, water, and lard slapped together and baked quick, and poured the cornmeal gravy over the top, hot and heavy. It wasn't silky, it wasn't pretty. It was thick, hearty, and stuck to your ribs like the memory of every hard season you'd lived through. Cornmeal gravy over biscuits wasn't something you served to company. It was something you served to family, to tired hands, to empty pockets. And for all its plainness, it filled you with a warmth that no fancy sauce ever could. Canned sardines on crackers. You didn't need a stove to make this meal, just a can opener, a stack of saltines, and an empty stomach. Canned sardines on crackers were the kind of dinner you could fix with one hand while the other rubbed the exhaustion out of your face. You peeled back the lid on the tiny tin, briny fish packed tight in oil or mustard sauce, and spooned them straight onto the crackers, one fillet at a time. Some people mashed them. Some ate them whole. Either way, they brought salt, fat, and protein to a plate that didn't have much else. If you had a slice of onion, you added it. If you had a splash of hot sauce, you drizzled. But most nights it was just fish, crackers, and quiet chewing. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. Sardines didn't apologize for their smell or their shine. They just fed you, fast and full, when the fridge was empty and the pantry echoed. Canned sardines on crackers weren't a delicacy. They were a defense against going to bed hungry. And for a lot of folks, that was more than enough. Cornmeal dumplings in broth. When the cupboard was nearly bare and soup alone wasn't enough, cornmeal dumplings turned thin broth into something that could hold you over. You brought water or stock to a boil, sometimes with scraps of onion, maybe a bone, or bit of meat from a previous meal. Into that went the dumplings. Cornmeal stirred with salt, a little lard or bacon grease, and just enough water to hold together. You dropped spoonfuls of the thick batter right into the bubbling liquid. They swelled up slow, soaking in the flavor and turning soft in the middle, firm at the edges. It was humble food, built to stretch, the kind of meal that didn't fill your plate, but filled your belly. Cornmeal dumplings weren't about flavor fireworks. They were about survival, patience, and the quiet kind of resourcefulness passed down from someone who never once wasted a bite. Macaroni and tomatoes. There was nothing glamorous about boiled macaroni dumped into a skillet full of canned tomatoes. But when you were broke, it tasted like pure genius. The macaroni soaked up the sharp, sweet tang of the tomatoes, stretching a 50-cent can and a handful of dry noodles into a meal that could feed 3 kids and still have a little left over for tomorrow. Salt, pepper, maybe a knob of butter if you were lucky. That was it. No fancy herbs, no Parmesan showers, just tomatoey, slippery noodles on a chipped plate, steaming in the kitchen while the radio played something soft in the background. White gravy and biscuits. Some days all you had was flour, grease, and a few scraps of baking powder to rub together into something that looked like dinner. White gravy and biscuits didn't need anything else. You stirred bacon fat or lard into a bubbling skillet, whisked in flour until it turned the color of toast, and then thinned it with water or milk into a thick, creamy flood of pure, peppery survival. The biscuits didn't need to be pretty, just rough mounds of dough baked until they barely held together, perfect for soaking up every drop of that heavy, salty gravy. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about hunger. About making sure nobody went to bed empty. About knowing that sometimes a plate of bread and sauce was enough to carry you through whatever the world had lined up next. Apple cider vinegar stew. This was depression food, sour, simple, and stronger than it looked. Apple cider vinegar stew started with whatever root vegetables you had, potatoes, onions, carrots. You peeled what needed peeling, chopped it all coarse, and threw it into a pot with water and a splash of cider vinegar. The vinegar cut through everything, brought brightness to the broth, and made up for the absence of meat. Sometimes there was a scrap of bacon or salt pork. Sometimes just a bay leaf or a clove of garlic. Most of the time it was the vegetables, the vinegar, and a long boil that made it something worth eating. You served it hot, ladled into bowls, and eaten with a spoon scraped across the bottom. It wasn't rich, but it was honest. It woke up your tongue, warmed your stomach, and reminded you that a little bite could be a blessing. Macaroni and milk. Macaroni and milk was about as bare-boned as comfort food came. You boiled macaroni until soft, drained it, and poured milk over it, just enough to keep it from feeling dry, just enough to feel like something warm and complete. A bit of butter, if you had it, a pinch of salt. Some people added pepper, some added sugar. Most did whatever their grandmother taught them to do. You didn't bake it. You didn't dress it up. You just stirred it and served it. It came to the table hot and bland, but there was something soothing in that. It didn't ask anything of you but a spoon and an appetite. Macaroni and milk was what you made when groceries were low and spirits were lower. It was soft, cheap, and filling, a blank page you could survive on. And when you had more again, you remembered how this little bowl had carried you through the worst of it. Bread and lard with salt. There was nothing fancier than the way you learned to survive. Bread and lard with salt was survival dressed in simplicity. A thick slice of bread, stale or fresh, it didn't matter, slathered with a cold smear of lard from the tin in the icebox. Not butter, not margarine, just fat. You sprinkled a few grains of salt across the top, ate it slow, ate it fast. Ate it because that was what there was. There wasn't a recipe. There wasn't a debate. It was a meal born of hardship and hardened hands, the kind that didn't ask for flavor as much as it asked for calories. And when it went down, it reminded you, full is full. Cabbage and potato soup. You didn't need much to make cabbage and potato soup. Just a pot, a flame, and the will to keep moving. You peeled and chopped the potatoes, rough and quick. Then came the cabbage, shredded by hand or knife into thick, wrinkled strips. You dropped everything into a big pot of salted water or thin broth. Let it boil until the cabbage softened and the potatoes cracked open just enough to cloud the liquid. Onion, if you had it. A clove of garlic, if you were lucky. But the heart of it was always the same. A cheap, honest meal that filled a bowl and stuck to your ribs. Served with stale bread or nothing at all, cabbage and potato soup reminded you that the line between survival and comfort was thinner than people think. It didn't win awards. It didn't need seasoning secrets. It just needed to be hot, heavy, and ready by the time the sun went down. Tomato sandwiches with salt and pepper. When the tomatoes came in, you didn't need much else. They were juicy, red, and still warm from the garden. You sliced them thick, laid them on white bread, and sprinkled them with salt and cracked black pepper. Sometimes there was mayonnaise, sometimes not. Either way, when you pressed that second slice on top, the tomato juice soaked through fast. You ate it leaning over the sink or the counter, wherever was easiest to wipe up the mess. It wasn't a fancy sandwich, but it tasted like summer and survival wrapped up in one. Tomato sandwiches were what you made when the pantry was bare, but the backyard still had something to give. You didn't need sides, silverware, or a story. Just ripe tomatoes, soft bread, and enough time to taste what the sun and soil had managed to produce. In some households, it was all there was for days, but it was enough. Cabbage roll, casserole, lazy man's version. Cabbage rolls were beautiful. Cabbage roll, casserole, was practical. You didn't have time to roll leaves and tie them up nice. You had 5 kids, 1 oven, and no meat to waste. You browned a little beef, or none at all, mixed it with cooked rice, onions, and canned tomato sauce. Chopped cabbage got layered in a baking dish, then the rice mixture, then more cabbage, and more sauce. You baked it covered until the cabbage went soft and the rice soaked up all the tangy, smoky juice. It came out messy, bubbling, fork tender, and full of soul. You didn't care how it looked. It tasted like something much fancier. Lazy man's cabbage roll casserole wasn't lazy. It was survival with a little creative license. And when it hit the table, nobody questioned how much effort went into it. They just ate, and that was enough. Dried apple and rice bake. This was a pantry dish, built from things that didn't go bad, even when everything else did. You boiled rice until tender, then folded in a handful of dried apples, chopped rough. A little sugar, a bit of cinnamon, and a spoonful of lard or butter turned it into something that almost felt like dessert. You poured it into a baking dish, baked it until the top set and the apples softened, then spooned it into bowls while it was still warm. It wasn't a flashy meal. It was quiet, simple, and sweet in a way that stuck with you. Dried apple and rice bake was what you made when you wanted comfort, but the store was too far, and the money was too short. And when you sat down to eat it, spoon in hand, it tasted like home. Mock chicken legs, city chicken. It looked like chicken. It tasted close, but there wasn't a feather in sight. Mock chicken legs, better known in factory towns as city chicken, were skewers of pork or veal dressed up to look like something more expensive. You took small cubes of cheap meat, threaded them tight onto wooden skewers, and breaded them like drumsticks. Then you pan-fried them until golden and crisp, finishing in the oven if you had the time. They came out hot, crunchy on the outside, juicy on the inside, and just familiar enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something finer. Served with mashed potatoes, gravy, canned peas, or just a hunk of white bread, city chicken turned a few scraps of meat into a meal that felt special, even when it wasn't. It wasn't about pretending. It was about working with what you had and making it taste like something worth sitting down for. That was the genius behind poor man's cooking. Pork neck bones with rice and gravy. They weren't the prettiest cut in the butcher case. Bony, fatty, and full of work. But pork neck bones carried flavor, like nothing else. You browned them hard in a hot pot, fat popping and spitting, then added water or broth and let them simmer slow. The meat clung tight to the bone at first, but after a couple of hours it softened, falling away in rich, tender bites. While the bones worked their magic, you stirred up a pot of white rice and let it sit covered, steam making each grain puff perfect. The gravy was the prize, thickened with flour or just reduced down to a silky, smoky sauce. It got poured heavy over the rice and scattered with bits of meat. No fancy presentation, no cutting required, just spoon after spoon of salty, rich, soul-warming food. Pork neck bones with rice and gravy didn't ask for praise. It just did its job, one bowl at a time. Oatmeal and bacon. Fat. There were nights when you didn't have sugar. No brown sugar, no syrup, no honey. Just a sack of oats and the old coffee tin of saved bacon grease by the stove. You boiled water, poured in the oats, and stirred until they thickened into something heavy and plain. Then you scooped in a spoonful of bacon fat, greasy, smoky, salted from breakfasts long gone, and stirred until the whole pot took on the flavor of better days. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't delicate, it was salty, hearty, and heavy enough to anchor a man to the ground through another freezing morning. You didn't dress it up. You ate it straight, bowl in one hand, spoon in the other, standing at the kitchen counter if the table was already piled with unpaid bills. Oatmeal with bacon fat wasn't a meal you made because you liked it. It was the meal you made because it stayed in your gut like armor. It was heavy and plain and real, and it kept you going when there wasn't much else to hold you up. Brown sugar and butter bread. When money ran out but the need for something sweet didn't, brown sugar and butter bread showed up. It was cheap, fast, and good enough to make the youngest kids smile and the oldest Wests remember better times. You took a slice of bread, fresh if you had it, stale if you didn't care, and spread it thick with butter, or margarine if real butter was a dream that week. Then you grabbed a handful of brown sugar and sprinkled it heavy over the top, letting it soak into the butter until it turned glossy and wet. Sometimes you toasted it, sometimes you just ate it straight, the sugar crunching between your teeth, the butter slick and salty against the back of your throat. It wasn't complicated, it wasn't healthy, it wasn't a meal you wrote letters about, but it was sweet. It filled the gap between dinner and bedtime, when the real desserts cost too much or didn't exist at all. Brown sugar and butter bread was poor man's candy, Depression-era cake, and a 5-minute reminder that comfort didn't need to come wrapped in a box or bought from a store. It could come from what you already had, and that was enough. Fried salt pork with grits. Salt pork was never the main event. It was the seasoning, the edge, the crackle. But if you had a thick slice and some grits to go with it, you had dinner. You sliced the salt pork into thick slabs, tossed them in a hot skillet, and waited until they blistered and curled. The fat rendered out, filling the pan with flavor. While that sizzled, grits simmered on the back burner, slow-cooked, salted just enough, and stirred until they were smooth as cream. When the pork was done, you poured the hot fat into the grits, stirred once, and plated the meat right on top. It was salty, rich, and hot. Grits soaked up every drop, and the pork added just enough chew to remind you there was meat involved. No one left hungry? Not that night. Fried bologna sandwich. If you grew up poor in mid-century America, Chances are you've heard the sputter of bologna hitting a hot, greasy pan. It would curl up at the edges like a tiny hat, the middle bubbling like a drum. Fried bologna wasn't glamorous, but it was the next best thing to steak for families counting every dime. It came in giant pink tubes from the deli counter or discount bins, sliced thick or thin, depending on how generous the grocer was feeling that day. You'd toss it into a skillet with a bit of leftover bacon grease or lard, slap it between two pieces of white bread, sometimes toasted if the stove was already hot, and maybe dress it with a smear of mustard or a slice of government cheese if you were feeling rich. In steel towns, mining camps, and inner cities alike, this sandwich became a staple of factory lunch pails and after-school snacks. The smell of sizzling bologna was unmistakable, salty, greasy, mouth-watering. In a way only hunger can exaggerate. It didn't need lettuce or artisan buns. It needed heat, bread, and the willingness to pretend you were eating something better. And often it was, because it tasted like home, like making do, like being fed by someone who loved you enough to get creative with very little. Dried apple and rice bake. When the harvests were bad and the fruit ran low, people turned to dried apples stored in sacks in the pantry. They were tough, wrinkled, and needed coaxing to come back to life. But with a little patience and a lot of need, they turned into something filling. You boiled the dried apples first, softened them back into something resembling fruit, sweetened them lightly with sugar or a dash of syrup if you could spare it. Then you stirred them into a pot of cooked white rice stretched thin, boiled soft with a little extra water because every grain had to count. Sometimes there was a splash of milk stirred in to make it creamy. Sometimes just a little cinnamon to trick the nose into thinking you were baking something fancy. You poured the whole mess into a greased baking dish and slid it into the oven. Baked it slow until the top crusted just a little, the apples sinking into the soft rice below. It wasn't dessert and it wasn't dinner, it was both. Warm, heavy, sweet enough to feel like a treat, but strong enough to fill the gap between a long day and a longer night. Dried apple and rice bake wasn't indulgence. It was endurance with a little bit of sweetness. Sloppy Joe stretch, heavy sauce, little meat. You didn't need much beef to make a sloppy Joe, just enough to color the sauce. That was the stretch. Start with a half-pound of ground beef, browned and broken, fine in the skillet. Then came the bulk, ketchup, mustard, maybe a little vinegar or brown sugar, onions if you had them, oats, or breadcrumbs if you wanted to pad it out further. The sauce simmered until it thickened, coating every crumb of meat until it looked like more than it was. Piled high on soft white bread or whatever rolls you could get your hands on, it oozed out the sides and made a mess that said, "Real food is happening here." Kids loved it. Adults leaned back full, and nobody asked how much meat was actually in there, because dinner was hot, sloppy, and good enough to forget the math. Lard and salt sandwich. It was a sandwich that didn't whisper luxury. It shouted survival. In the rural stretches of America, especially the South and parts of Appalachia, lard was more than a cooking fat. It was sustenance in a jar. When meat was scarce and butter too expensive, folks would smear thick layers of pork lard onto stale slices of white bread, sometimes warmed just enough to soften, then sprinkle on salt for taste. The bread was often homemade or store-bought at a discount rack, day-old, maybe mold-trimmed. This sandwich had no fancy name, but for the working poor, it filled bellies and kept the body going for hours of farm work, factory shifts, or walking long distances. Some added cracked black pepper, a dash of vinegar, or a sliver of onion, if the garden allowed it. Kids sometimes brought them to school, wrapped in wax paper or newspaper. It was greasy, heavy, and left a white film on the fingers. But it was calories. It was comfort. And above all, it was cheap. It told the story of a family doing the best they could with the scraps life handed them. And despite its humble ingredients, there was something oddly warming about it. Like the fat itself carried the memory of the hog butchering season, smokehouses, and kinfolk gathered around a wood stove in winter. Navy bean soup with salt pork. This wasn't a soup for sipping. It was a soup for working. Thick, salty, and heavy. Navy bean soup was built to keep you going when the pantry and paycheck were both running dry. You soaked the beans overnight, softened them up, then dropped them into a deep pot with chunks of salt pork, cheap, fatty cuts that gave up all their flavor as they simmered. Onions and maybe a carrot went in too. Garlic, if you had it. But it was the salt pork that made the difference, melting down, fat rendering into the broth, meat turning tender. It cooked for hours. By the end, the beans were soft, the broth was golden, and the smell filled the whole house like a promise. You served it thick with cornbread, if you had it, or just a torn-off slice of white bread to chase it down. Navy bean soup didn't waste anything. It didn't pretend. It just showed up hot, hearty, and ready to do the job. Fried bologna sandwiches. Fried bologna sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. You slapped a slice of bologna onto a hot skillet and watched it puff and curl at the edges like a cheap umbrella turning inside out. Sometimes you scored little cuts around the edge to keep it flat. Sometimes you just let it go wild. Either way, you dropped it between two slices of white bread, maybe with a smear of mustard or a scrap of cheese if you had it, and called it dinner. The fat crisped around the edges. The middle stayed juicy and salty. It wasn't pretty, and it didn't last long once it hit your hands. Fried bologna sandwiches were food for the tired, the broke, and the too dang busy to care about anything more than getting something hot and salty into their mouths before collapsing into bed. Cabbage fritters. Cabbage fritters weren't fancy. They were desperation, fried up, golden, and crisp. You started with what you had. A withering head of cabbage, some flour, a few tablespoons of bacon grease, maybe one egg if you could spare it. You shredded the cabbage fine, stirred it into a loose, sticky batter, and dropped fat spoonfuls onto a hot skillet. They sputtered in the grease, smelling sharp and green and alive. You flattened them with the back of your spoon, pressing them hard into the pan so they crisped at the edges. No fancy sauces, no careful plating, just a plate stacked with hot fritters, greasy at the edges, heavy enough to keep a man moving through a winter shift. If there was vinegar, you splashed it over the top. If not, you ate them plain, hot, rough, and good enough to make the house smell like there was something worth sitting down for. Cabbage fritters didn't cost much, but they gave you the sense, for a few minutes, that you were still doing all right, still making dinner happen, still finding a way. Egg drop soup with scraps. This wasn't a recipe, it was a last stand. When all you had was a broth base, a couple vegetables, and one egg, you made egg drop soup. Water and bouillon made the broth. Maybe there was a real chicken carcass left from Sunday. More often, it was just hot, salty liquid with a few scraps of onion, celery, or carrots tossed in from the back of the icebox. The egg was the magic. Whisked in a bowl, then poured slowly into the boiling broth while stirring, it turned into silky ribbons that swirled around like something elegant. A dash of pepper gave it bite. A little vinegar or soy sauce if someone had traveled far enough to pick some up. Served in mugs or soup bowls or whatever was clean, it didn't look like much. But it was warm, nourishing, and felt, just for a moment, like a real meal. And sometimes that moment was enough. Lard biscuits with sorghum syrup. Biscuits didn't need butter to be good. They didn't need buttermilk, fancy flour, or anything from a store shelf marked luxury. They needed flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and a good hard dollop of cold lard, cut in with fingertips that knew the work of real kitchens. You mixed the dough by hand, rolled it rough, and cut it into thick, squat rounds that hit the oven like promises you had to keep. They baked up craggy and hot, smelling like every good thing you still had left. When they came out, you split them open with your hands, no knife needed, and spooned sorghum syrup into the steamy middle. The syrup oozed into every crack, soaked through the crumb, and sweetened the air with the smell of warm sugar and hot bread. Lard biscuits with sorghum syrup were sticky, messy, and heavy enough to carry you through 2 chores and a skipped lunch. They weren't about celebrating. They were about surviving, with a little sweetness in the hard times. And sometimes that was enough to lift a tired family 1 more mile down the road. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches, properly expanded. When the meat was gone and payday was still too far away, you reached for the egg carton and the vinegar bottle. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches weren't fancy, but they were fast, cheap, and just good enough to feel like real food. You boiled the eggs hard, no runny yolks, no careful timing. Just a full rolling boil until they were chalky and firm. Peeled them quick, crushed them rough with a fork, and stirred in a heavy splash of vinegar to wake them up. The vinegar made the eggs sing, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavy yolk like a hot knife. You pile the mixture onto slices of bread, sometimes adding a pinch of salt, maybe a crack of pepper if the jar wasn't empty. The bread soaked up the vinegar, softening just enough to hold everything together. It wasn't elegant, but it was rich with flavor and heavy enough to quiet a stomach gnawing from too many lean nights. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. They were sour, strong, and stubborn as the people who made them, and every bite carried a promise. You were still standing, and you were still eating. Peanut butter and pickle sandwich. This wasn't a dare. It was a Depression-era miracle that stuck around through sheer audacity. Spread salty peanut butter on soft white bread. Then top it with a few slices of dill pickle. That's it. The sharp vinegar of the pickle cut through the dry stickiness of the peanut butter like lightning. For some, it was a flavor revolution. For others, an act of desperation. Either way, it filled a lunchbox, silenced a growling stomach, and left a memory that outlasted hunger. This odd pairing was often born from leftovers. The last bit of peanut butter clinging to the jar, and a few pickles floating lonely in brine. The sandwich traveled in wax paper to schoolyards and rail cars. It didn't need refrigeration, didn't spoil fast, and made a little go a long way. Some added mustard for an extra jolt. Some swore by sweet pickles instead of dill, but the essence was the same: salty, sour, sticky, survival. It was a sandwich that shouldn't work, but did, just like the people who ate it. Cornbread and buttermilk soup. Some nights, you didn't cook. You just poured and stirred. Cornbread and buttermilk soup was a no-fire dinner, simple, strange, and stubbornly Southern. You crumbled leftover cornbread into a big bowl, chunks, crumbs, whatever you had. Then you poured cold buttermilk over it, just enough to soak the bread and pool around the edges. A spoon did the rest. There was no cooking, no seasoning, just corn, milk, and memory. The flavor was tangy, earthy, and oddly refreshing. It cooled you down in the summer and saved your groceries in the winter. Some folks added salt, others stirred in a little sugar, but most left it alone and just ate. Cornbread and buttermilk wasn't meant to impress. It was a filler, a lifeline, and a legacy all at once. If you grew up on it, it tasted like childhood. If you came to it later, it tasted like surviving without making a fuss. Split pea soup with ham hocks. Split pea soup didn't care what day of the week it was. It was cheap, thick, and hot. And if you had a ham hock to throw in the pot, you were eating better than most. You started with dried green peas, rinsed clean, and boiled low and slow with onions, garlic, maybe a chopped carrot, if there was one, lying around. The ham hock went in whole, bone and all, bringing fat, smoke, and salt to every corner of the broth. Hours passed, and the peas melted into a creamy stew. The meat softened until it slid off the bone in rich, chewy shreds. Some folks added potatoes. Some didn't. Either way, it came to the table thick enough to stand a spoon in. You served it with crusty bread or just ate it out of a chipped bowl in silence. It didn't need sides. It didn't need help. Split pea soup with ham hocks wasn't pretty, but it was dependable, it was filling, and it turned the cheapest bag of legumes into something worth scraping every drop from the pot. Onion and tomato salad with bread. When the garden was all you had left, you ate what it gave you, and often that meant tomatoes and onions, sharp, juicy, simple. You sliced them thick, the onions biting back tears, the tomatoes bleeding juice all over the counter. Toss them together with salt, pepper, and a drizzle of vinegar or oil if you had it. If not, the juices alone did the work. You laid the mixture onto thick slices of bread, or used the bread to soak up the puddle of juice at the bottom of the bowl. It wasn't salad, the way fancy restaurants talked about salad. It was survival in a bowl, sharp, refreshing, and just heavy enough to remind you were still standing. Onion and tomato salad with bread wasn't built for presentation. It was built for hot kitchens with fans in the windows and not much else in the icebox. And somehow, on the right summer evening, it tasted like the richest thing in the world. Potato soup with saltine crackers. It didn't get much simpler or more stubborn than potato soup. You peeled and chopped potatoes rough, boiled them with a little salt until they softened, then mashed them half-heartedly right there in the broth. A splash of milk if you had it, a pat of butter if you could spare it. Otherwise, just water and starch and the quiet satisfaction of knowing there'd be something hot in every bowl. Saltines sat in a chipped tin on the counter. You crushed them over the soup, letting them melt into the broth, thickening it just enough to feel heavy on the spoon. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't even fancy enough to pretend. But it filled your belly, warmed your hands, and reminded you that even when the cupboards were thin, dinner still showed up if you worked for it. Mashed potato sandwich. Leftovers never went to waste, not when mouths outnumbered dollars. After supper, the cold, mashed potatoes went back into the icebox. By noon the next day, they became the core of a mashed potato sandwich. Thick slabs of bread cradled a scoop of cold, salted mashed spuds, sometimes smeared with mustard or topped with an onion slice. It was starchy, heavy, and oddly comforting. Some days, a crust of gravy clung to the potato and made it feel like more than scraps. This was a lunchbox favorite for mill workers, coal miners, and school kids alike. Easy to make, cheap to pack, and dense with enough carbs to keep the belly full. It wasn't elegant, but it did the job. Some toasting the bread gave it contrast. Others preferred it soft. It often showed up on Mondays, when Sunday's roast was long gone, but the potatoes lived on. The sandwich was a quiet reminder that in hard times, food was circular. Nothing ended. It just changed shape. Leftovers were sacred, and sandwiches like these were a badge of resourcefulness. Ketchup sandwiches. You didn't eat a ketchup sandwich because you loved it. You ate it because the fridge was empty and ketchup was still there. Spread across soft bread or stiff bread, if that's all you had, it gave sweetness, tang, and color to an otherwise blank meal. You folded it over and ate it fast, maybe with a little shame, maybe with a quiet laugh. It filled you, barely. But sometimes barely was enough. Ketchup sandwiches were desperation wrapped in softness, a last resort that still showed up when everything else was gone. Rice pudding as dinner. When meat ran out and vegetables were too expensive, rice pudding stepped in, sweet, heavy, and warm. It was one of the few dinners that felt like a treat when you had nothing left to treat yourself with. You boiled white rice until soft, then stirred in milk, sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt. If the cupboards were kind, you added cinnamon or a handful of raisins. If they weren't, you made do. You let the mixture simmer low until it thickened into a creamy, sticky comfort, something between a dessert and a survival plan. Sometimes an egg went in to make it richer. Most times it didn't. You spooned it into bowls and ate it slow, letting the warmth settle into your bones. Rice pudding didn't care that it was dinner. It just did the job, filling you up with something soft, sweet, and simple enough to remind you there was still goodness in the world. And when you scraped the bottom of the pot, you didn't feel cheated. You felt full. Butter and lettuce sandwich. Simple, humble, cold. The butter and lettuce sandwich was less a meal and more a memory of gardens that grew wild and fridges that hummed half empty. Fresh, limp lettuce leaves, often iceberg or romaine, laid over a layer of salted butter on plain bread. No protein, no dressing, no frills. It was the sandwich you made when all the meat was gone, the kids were hungry, and the garden was generous enough to offer something green. The butter gave it richness, the lettuce gave it crunch. It was eaten by coal miners' daughters, dust bowl mothers, and millions of children who learned early what it meant to make do. Some toasted the bread, others didn't bother. Some added a slice of tomato if the harvest was kind, but mostly it was butter, lettuce, and hope layered quietly in a kitchen where the radio murmured about war, work, or wheat prices. It was the kind of sandwich that reminded you food wasn't always about pleasure. Sometimes it was about continuity, the ritual of lunch, the semblance of normalcy. And in that, it offered comfort, rice and butter with cinnamon sugar. Sometimes dinner came in the form of a dessert that didn't know it was a dessert. You boiled rice till it was soft and tender, drained it, and while it was still hot, stirred in a big slab of butter until every grain gleamed. Then came the cinnamon and sugar, shaken from old tins, sprinkled with a heavy hand, until the air smelled sweet enough to trick your body into thinking you were celebrating something. You didn't plate it fancy. You didn't bake it. You scooped it into bowls and ate it steaming hot, the sugar melting into syrupy puddles at the bottom. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar wasn't filling like meat and potatoes. It didn't stick like beans and bread, but it gave you a sense of comfort that sometimes mattered more. It warmed you from the inside out, made you sit a little taller at the dinner table, even if the pantry behind you was nearly bare. It wasn't about being full. It was about remembering what a little sweetness could do to a tired heart. Ketchup sandwich. This was poverty on white bread, pure and unfiltered. The ketchup sandwich was exactly what it sounds like. Slices of plain bread, often store-brand or homemade, slathered with whatever ketchup was available. Sometimes it was Heinz, but more often it was the cheapest bottle on the shelf or even homemade from surplus tomatoes. This sandwich was the last line of defense between a child and going to bed hungry. It showed up on dinner tables during layoffs, droughts, or long winters when the pantry looked more like a shelf of empty jars than a source of nourishment. Parents told their kids it was just like a burger, just without the meat, and kids played along, licking the tangy sweetness off their fingers. In some households, it was toasted to add a bit of crunch, and in others, it was folded over to make it feel more like a real sandwich. The ketchup was sugary, acidic, and often watery, but it filled the stomach and added enough flavor to trick the mind into believing it was a meal. There was no pride in it, just resilience. And in a strange way, those who ate it never forgot it. It became a badge of survival, a taste memory tied to struggle, resourcefulness, and the stubborn will to get through another day. Salt pork and beans. Salt pork and beans was more than a meal. It was a method. You soaked the dried beans overnight, not because it was fancy cooking, but because the beans were stubborn and needed convincing. Come morning, they went into a big pot with slabs of salt pork, fatty, meaty, salty cuts that were closer to preservation than indulgence. As the pot simmered low and slow, the salt pork broke down, melting its flavor into every bean. The smell filled the house and stuck to the walls, thick, smoky, a scent that promised something worth waiting for. You didn't rush it. You let the beans get soft, the broth thicken, and the salt pork turn tender enough to fall apart under your spoon. Some folks added onions, a pinch of sugar, maybe some black pepper or molasses if the cupboard was generous. It came to the table with nothing but a slice of cornbread or white bread to soak up the juices. It wasn't delicate. It was tough, salty, and heavy in the best way. Salt pork and beans didn't just fill a plate. It filled a family, a work day, a week, and in hard times, that meant everything. Boiled potatoes with canned green beans. You started with the potatoes, peeled or not depending on time and preference. Boiled them in salted water until they were soft enough to mash with a fork but not falling apart. Then you dumped in a can of green beans, liquid and all, and let everything simmer together for a few minutes. The beans took on the starch of the potatoes. The potatoes took on the salt of the beans. Some folks drained it and served it with butter. Others left it as is, watery and plain, and ladled it out into bowls. It was a no-fuss meal, warm and gentle on the stomach, something to serve the kids when the money had run dry, but dinner still had to happen. It didn't look like much, and it wasn't meant to, but it got the job done. Hot food, fast, and enough for everyone to get seconds. Hominy and salt. Hominy wasn't glamorous. It didn't dress up the plate. It didn't even pretend to be exciting. But it stuck to your ribs, and in a world where food had to work as hard as you did, that was all anyone asked for. You cracked open a big can or boiled dried hominy if you were lucky enough to have the patience. You dumped it into a pot, salted it heavy, and simmered it until the kernels swelled soft and fragrant. Some nights you fried it crisp in bacon grease. Other nights you just ate it as it came, a big steaming bowl of chewy, salty corn. No butter, no pepper, just heat, salt, and stubbornness. It didn't taste like much, but it filled you. It coated your stomach in warmth and starch and got you through the nights when the wind howled too hard and the workday stretched too long. Hominy and salt wasn't a meal you bragged about. It was a meal you remembered because it showed up when nothing else did. and when every bite mattered more than anything else in the world. Hot dog and potato hash. It was a scramble, a messy, glorious scramble of chopped hot dogs and diced potatoes fried hard in a big skillet, the potatoes browned and crisped at the edges, the hot dogs split and sizzled, their skins blistering in the heat. Sometimes an onion found its way into the pan. Sometimes a leftover scrap of cheese melted over the top if you had something fancy like that lying around. You piled it onto a plate, doused it with ketchup or mustard if you wanted, and ate standing up at the stove because sitting down took too long. Hot dog and potato hash wasn't a meal you planned. It was a meal you survived, and most nights that was good enough. Buttered noodles with black pepper. When money got tight and the day was long, buttered noodles with pepper was the meal that answered back. Boil pasta, any kind. Drain it, drop in a stick of butter, or however much was left, and stir until every noodle was coated and shiny. Then hit it with the black pepper. A lot of black pepper. No cheese, no sauce. Just butter, heat, and pepper, sharp enough to make your mouth pay attention. Served in a bowl, eaten with a spoon, and maybe chased with a piece of bread, it didn't pretend to be anything but what it was. Simple, fast, and filling. Exactly what you needed at the end of the kind of day you didn't want to talk about. Noodle and ketchup skillet. This wasn't spaghetti. This was survival. You boiled a handful of dry noodles, elbows, egg noodles, whatever was cheapest, and when they were soft, you drained them and dumped them back into the skillet. Then came the ketchup, not sauce, ketchup. Squeezed straight from the bottle, stirred in until the noodles turned red and slippery. A pinch of salt, maybe a little pepper. Some folks added chopped onion, if they had it, or a cube of butter to smooth it out. You let it sizzle for a minute, the ketchup caramelizing just enough to smell like something more than what it was. It hit the plate hot, sweet, and tangy. It wasn't trying to taste like Italian food. It wasn't trying to taste like anything but enough. Noodle and ketchup skillet didn't pretend. It filled the belly and stretched the budget. And for families who didn't have meat or cheese or even a can of tomato sauce, it got the job done. Fried rice with whatever? Leftovers. Fried rice was never planned. It was built from what got left behind. Cold rice, scraps of meat, half an onion, a spoonful of peas hiding in the back of the freezer. You dumped it all into a hot skillet slicked with bacon, grease, oil, or whatever fat you had. Fried it fast, stirred it hard, scraped the bottom to catch all the crispy bits. If you had an egg, you scrambled it in. If you didn't, you added more rice. Soy sauce was a blessing. Salt and pepper were the usual stand-ins. It didn't matter what went in. The result was always the same. Hot, savory, full of flavor and heat. A spoonful of fried rice filled more than your belly. It filled the gap between not knowing what to cook and making something that felt like real food. And when it was gone, you were full. That was all it had to be. Fried apples and biscuits. You peeled and sliced the apples thin, tossed them in a skillet with butter, or bacon grease if that's all you had, and sprinkled sugar over the top like a memory. They fried down slow, turning golden and soft, the sugar bubbling into syrup, and the fruit collapsing into sweet, sticky ribbons. Meanwhile, you baked up a batch of biscuits from scratch. Just flour, lard, baking powder, and water if that was all the pantry allowed. They came out uneven but hot, split down the middle, and steaming. You spooned the fried apples right on top. Let the syrup soak in. Ate it with your hands or a fork, depending on how tired the day had made you. It wasn't breakfast. It wasn't dessert. It was just food, sweet, simple, and so good it almost made you forget how little was in the icebox. Fried apples and biscuits reminded you that comfort didn't need cost. It needed heat, time, and a little sugar. Dandelion greens with vinegar. Nobody planted dandelions. They just grew, and when money was tight, that made them the most reliable crop around. Dandelion greens were bitter, wild, and free. And when boiled and dressed with vinegar, they became dinner. You picked them young, before the leaves turned tough and angry, gave them a good wash to get the dirt and bugs out, then boiled them down until they wilted into a deep green tangle. Some folks fried a bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. Others just added a splash of vinegar and hoped it was enough. The taste was sharp, earthy, and strong. It hit your mouth like a warning and went down like a challenge. But it filled you, and it reminded you that nature didn't care about the price of groceries. If you were willing to look low, it would feed you. Served with cornbread or a slice of white bread, dandelion greens with vinegar was never anyone's favorite meal, but it was there when you needed it. And in hard times, that made it special. Cabbage and noodles, haluski. This was old country food brought to the New World's poorest tables. Cabbage and noodles, haluski, if you were raised on it, was butter, starch, and brassica turned into belly-filling gold. You boiled egg noodles soft and set them aside. Meanwhile, a whole head of cabbage, chopped thick, hit a skillet with butter or bacon grease. Fried slow, it browned at the edges, turned sweet, and filled the house with a smell that made your stomach growl. The noodles went back in, everything tossed together until it glistened. Salt, pepper, done. Maybe some onions if you were feeling rich. It wasn't a side dish. It was dinner, and it didn't need to be anything more. Haluski didn't try to prove a point. It just made sure you were fed, and that you'd want more tomorrow. Hardtack and butter. Hardtack wasn't food you made because you wanted to. It was food you made because you had no other choice. A brick of flour, water, and salt baked until it was dry enough to survive a war. Hardtack lived longer than the people who made it. When there wasn't meat, when there wasn't soup, and when there wasn't even a can of beans left in the pantry, you reached for hardtack. You cracked it open if you were strong enough, softened it in coffee or milk if you weren't, and spread butter, real, rancid, or substitute, over the jagged top to make it something almost edible. The butter soaked into the cracks, softened the chew a little, and gave it a richness that your tongue craved after too many lean meals. Sometimes you dipped it into hot broth to make it manageable. Other times you ate it as it was, dry and dense, grinding it down with tired teeth. Hardtack and butter wasn't dinner for those who wanted luxury. It was dinner for those who understood that a full stomach, even one filled with a meal older than the clothes on your back, was still a blessing worth fighting for. Cold meatloaf, sandwiches. Meatloaf always got better the second day, once the fat firmed up and the seasoning settled into every bite. Cold meatloaf sandwiches were about making yesterday's scraps into today's prize. You cut thick slices straight from the fridge, slapped them onto white bread, and squirted a heavy line of mustard across the top. No fancy toasters, no fancy sauces, just meat, bread, and whatever dignity you could scrape together on a Tuesday morning. Sometimes a slice of onion made it into the sandwich. Sometimes just a pickle on the side. Either way, it was sturdy, heavy, and enough to keep you moving until quitting time. Liver spread on crackers. In houses where nothing got wasted, even the scraps of liver were given new life. Liver spread on crackers was poor man's pâté, rough, strong tasting, but filling enough to make a meal when there wasn't much else around. You started by boiling or frying up the liver, beef, chicken, pork, whatever you could find cheap, until it was cooked through and crumbly. Then you mashed it into a coarse paste with whatever fat you had lying around, bacon drippings, lard, or butter if you were lucky, salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of onion powder or garlic made it just palatable enough. You spread it thick onto saltines or old biscuits, stacking them up until the liver filled the gaps between the cracks. It was salty, earthy, and bold, something you ate not because it was delicate, but because it was heavy and stuck with you. Each bite carried the iron tang of survival, a flavor that didn't apologize for its rough edges. You could feed 3 kids and 2 tired adults on a plate of liver spread and crackers. And in those kitchens, that meant success. It was food that came from necessity, dressed up just enough to trick the mind into calling it a meal. Sugar sandwich. It was the kind of thing whispered about in lunchrooms, but devoured in the privacy of a dim kitchen. Just a slice of white bread, cheap, soft, and without character, smeared with margarine, then sprinkled generously with white sugar. Sometimes the bread was folded in half, like a taco. Other times, stacked with another slice to mimic the real thing. In homes where meat was a luxury and cereal was a Sunday-only treat, the sugar sandwich became a last resort, a dessert, or even breakfast. The margarine, often from a government-issued block or a tub of oleo, would soften into the crumb of the bread, creating a greasy glue that held the sugar in place. Every bite crunched with the sound of crystals grinding against teeth, and for a few seconds the world didn't seem quite so empty. This sandwich came alive, especially during the early mornings before school or late at night when dinner was missed or stretched too thin. It was a favorite among children who didn't know any better, and a quiet shame for parents who wished they could give more, but it also tasted like stolen joy, a cheap thrill in a world where there weren't many. Fried raccoon, or opossum, rural South. In some places, meat didn't come from a butcher. It came from the woods, the road, or a trap out back. Raccoon and opossum were greasy, gamey, and tough, but they were protein, and they fed you. You skinned and cleaned the animal carefully, real carefully. Removed the scent glands, trimmed the fat. Parboiled it first to cut the wildness, then fried it in lard with a dusting of flour, salt, and pepper. The meat browned up crisp, smelling stronger than most were used to, served alongside greens, sweet potatoes, or just bread. It was heavy and rich, something you chewed through with your jaw and your pride. In the rural South, this wasn't strange. It was supper. It was resourcefulness. You didn't brag about it, but you didn't waste it either. Rice and red beans. Rice and red beans was the meal that stretched for miles. 1 pot, 2 ingredients, and time. That was all it needed. The beans soaked overnight, softening up for the long boil ahead. Come morning, you'd throw them into a heavy pot with a ham bone, salt pork, or nothing at all if meat was short. Simmered slow, the beans turned creamy and thick. By sundown, they clung to the spoon and carried the scent of something far more expensive than what actually went into the pot. The rice was cheap and dependable, boiled plain and ready to soak up all the flavor. Poured over a pile, the beans made a whole meal out of very little. Some folks added hot sauce, others just spooned it in and leaned back full. Rice and red beans didn't make a scene. It just showed up hot, heavy, and right on time. Scalloped potatoes and onions. There wasn't a casserole dish in town that hadn't seen scalloped potatoes and onions. It was a staple, simple, cheap, and stretched so far it might as well have been elastic. You sliced the potatoes thin, real thin. Onions, too, layered them in a buttered pan with a little salt, maybe a sprinkle of flour between each level, and poured watered-down milk or canned evaporated milk over the whole thing. Baked low and slow, the top turned golden and crusty, while the bottom simmered into a soft, starchy comfort. No cheese, no cream, just patience. You pulled it out when the edges bubbled and the smell filled the kitchen. Rich, savory, and just a little sweet from the onions. It was dinner by itself, or a side to stretch out a lonely pork chop or a spoonful of beans. Scalloped potatoes and onions didn't claim to be a feast, but it was hot, filling, and could feed 6 people with 3 potatoes. In a house where the lights flickered and the fridge echoed, that made it royalty.